My name is Jeremy Martin. I'm the pastor here at Downtown Faith, and I'm just excited to be with you today. I've been excited about today all morning. Even woke up kind of bad and still was very excited just because I think our discussion today is going to be something really important. We're in our discussion series, Hearing God. And so last week we began the whole discussion by talking about the ancient Babylonian god Marduk. And we said that there was this God, and there was a story of this God in creation, and we see that post the exile in Babylon, that the people of Israel, after their time in Babylon, they're going back to Jerusalem, and they're compiling their stories, and they're composing their stories, and they take these accounts and they create the account that we find in Genesis, and Genesis, and specifically the creation story that we find at the very beginning of our Bible. Wasn't this historical or scientific documentation, but it was a theological response. It was who is our God, right? They had been in Babylon. They knew who Marduk was, that there was a celebration every year portraying the violent creation story of Marduk. And it was but who's our God, and who are we as people of this God? And so they created their creation story, and we see their story, and we find in that what God is like, and we find a very different God. And we said that hearing what God has to say begins with the belief that God is saying something. You see, in Genesis, this God speaks things into existence. Rather than through violence and warring, that this God merely spoke things into existence, and that human beings weren't an afterthought as servants of this God, but that this God said, hey, we're going to create man in our image to be like us and to be in relationship. We see that human beings were created with a purpose and with purpose, and they were created creatively to be creative, so we find this very different God and this very different picture of who we are as people of God. And when looking at the creation story in the Bible, we see a speaking God. And we said that A.W. Tozer, who is just an author and pastor from the early 1900s, that I just think was writing things way ahead of his time, and some deeply spiritual things. And he says, God is speaking. Not God spoke. Not God spoke at creation, or not God spoke and then the Bible and it was done and that's what we have. It's God is speaking. Not God spoke, but God is speaking. He is by His nature continuously articulate. He fills the world with His speaking voice. That God is speaking in and around all of us, all of the time, in you and through others. And we said that a personal God speaks personally and in persons. That the God that we find in the Genesis account is this personal God who has this personal relationship with His creation. And that there is this personal nature to the divine, where it's not just some faraway big G God out there kind of doing its thing, and then we're here doing our thing, but that there's this relationship that God actually cares about you and created people with that in mind, and actually created people in the image of the divine. And that not just personally is God speaking to us, but in person through the person of Jesus. That God spoke to us, that Jesus was this full expression of the thoughts, plans, feelings, actions, and intentions of God towards mankind. And that like we say around here, we want to follow Jesus, and we're helping people do the same, right? We want to follow Jesus into a new life. What we understand is that we are following literally the Word of God, the expression of God, that Jesus didn't become God, but He came as God, and was this full expression. And we use John in his gospel account uses the words life and light that he brought to people, to his own creation. And then we asked this question at the end. We didn't really answer, but we left it hanging. It was this: God is speaking. Do you hear it? Right? Because isn't that the other thing? Right? Okay, if God is speaking, if He's continuously articulate, why can't I hear it? Maybe it's a little like the game we played earlier, right? I can't tell if that's one thing or the other. I can't tell if that's God. I can't tell if that's this voice or this voice. I don't know if it's saying this or this. And the real hardship is God is speaking, okay? And maybe we begin with that belief, but then what next? Do you hear it? And I would say maybe not. Maybe some of you are like, yes, I feel very in touch, very in tune with God and God's relationship with God. And there's other people sitting across the table that go, yeah, I have no idea. And some of the things I love about this gathering is we have people on all across the spectrum. But if we're not hearing God, I think there's a wonderful explanation to help us. It's really going to kind of be the crux of our conversation today. And when I said yesterday, I posted on Facebook, I was going to be bringing something old school out. And so if some of you maybe grew up in church or you did youth ministry in like the early 2000s, you're going to go, oh, okay, I remember this. But I had this sitting on my bookshelf, and I was like, oh, this is going to help. The noise in our life, and I know maybe it's ironic to get up and talk about being silent, but for a little bit, I just want to kind of wrap that idea up, simply with our idea worth discussing today. Retreating from the noise of life positions us to hear the voice of God. Retreating from the noise of life positions us to hear the voice of God. And being quiet is hard, it's difficult when we buy into the myth that if we are being still, we aren't being productive. How many of you struggle with that? I know I have. I know I do all the time. If I'm not on the move, if I'm still, if I'm quiet, if I'm focused, that somehow I'm not being productive. But I believe the most productive moments of the soul are found in stillness. It is found when we position ourselves to hear God's voice by cutting out the noise. And I know what you're thinking, right? This guy doesn't know I have kids, or I have a job, or I have this. I get it. Life is full. Life is full for all of us. And I also know you might be thinking this too. Well, he's a pastor, so his whole job is just to sit around and listen to God, right? Like that's all he does all day, every day. A couple of things. First off, I have 2 kids, and that's not all I do. And I wasn't always a pastor. I do understand what it's like to, within the regular modes of life, to find the quiet place, to find the stillness. As the psalmist says, this is some lyrics from some Hebrew songs. Be still and know that I am God. Be still in the presence of the Lord. And these aren't, sometimes we look at the Bible and we go, oh, well, those are commands and we have to do them. No, this was a guy writing a song. Songs don't feel like commands, right? Songs feel like expressions of the heart and the soul. That's really where this is coming from. Singing the song, be still and know that He is God. Be still in the presence of God. You know, this was something, as I said earlier, we follow Jesus. This was something that was a regular discipline of Jesus. I've been reading through the Gospel of Matthew recently, and it's astounding how many times Jesus leaves the crowd of people where He could have been healing, He could have been teaching, He could have been productive, and He leaves. He even sometimes in the front of the people just gets in a boat and goes to the other side of the lake to get away from the people. Why? Because He absolutely 100% needed the time of stillness, the time of solitude. He needed to hear from God, His Father, and I would say that we need the same thing. And if you follow Jesus today, I would say this is a great thing in which to follow Jesus, is in the disciplines of silence and solitude. Why? Because retreating from the noise of life positions us to hear the voice of God. Now, we're going to talk more about this next week, the real practical side. And actually next week, if you can come, and you can even bring someone with you, we're going to try and help each of us discover how we best naturally hear from God. How we best naturally position ourselves, because I think it's different for probably almost every person in here. So we're going to talk about that real practical way, but there's 2 things, and maybe you're a person who takes notes and write them down. Retreating from the noise of life, right? Retreating from the noise of life, I think requires 2 things. It requires a plan, and it requires a place. It requires a plan, it requires a place. Why does it require a plan? Well, because your calendar is full. Your days are full. And if you don't put it in your calendar, if you don't put it in an immovable spot in your life, you probably won't do it. Maybe you're in here and you say, I don't really follow Jesus. I'm not really trying to hear God. You know, science will back this up as well. The studies are in. Silence and solitude and meditation is healthy for you. We are an all-time high stress society. And yet we are an all-time low of depression and anxiety. These are very real things in our life in modern-day America. And maybe the answer is some silence and some solitude. It requires a plan. You put it in your calendar. It's immovable. It doesn't get shaken. It doesn't get replaced. And maybe it's 5 minutes in the morning, maybe it's 10 minutes at night, maybe it's 4 hours away once a month. I'm not sure what that looks like for you. And again, next week we're going to talk about a little bit how you can create that plan, how you can practically begin to position yourself. But ultimately it takes two things, a plan and a place. And the place is going to be important next week as well. Because the place matters to your heart, to your soul, to your mind, to your noise level. So, retreating from the noise of life positions us to hear the voice of God. This is what we're going to talk about today. But before we do that, I want to invite our musicians up.